the way that we think about the relationship between sex and gender is relatively modern, and so. But it is incredibly entrenched, and it organises sort of almost every facet of society. So I think that this idea that there could be people who are something else, or who are neither gender or both genders, or another type of gender altogether, people don't like it. It messes with the kind of easy, simplistic way in which they've always thought about those things.
Hello and welcome to Different Conversations, where every week we have a different academic from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Westminster, talking to us about their work, what's different, what's interesting, and just what's going on right now. This week, I've got Frances Ray White. Frances, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's great to be here.
And it's great to have you. This is someone we've been trying to pin down for a bit, a little bit of emails back and forth, but we've got you now. And so maybe as a bit of a freebie intro, you could introduce yourself, who you are, what your elevator pitch is for our audience.
So I teach here in the Sociology department at Westminster. I've been here for 14 years now, and I teach a lot of modules on gender and sexuality and the sociology of the body. And so, my research interests are in those kinds of areas, and I've been pursuing various things. So I've got a longer history of writing about fat bodies, and I've been thinking about the intersections between fat bodies and transgender bodies, and basically sort of how fat shapes gender in different kinds of ways. I've also been working on a big ESRC project about trans pregnancy for the last few years, which is about to come to an end. And I've also been doing some research about non-binary gender people in higher education, so staff and students, which is an ongoing research project as well. So I've got a few things on the go, not, less so right at the moment, but yeah.
I think every time I talk to anybody for this podcast, it's always like, well, I do just a little bit here and there and a few things, and it's this amazing list of stuff that keeps us busy, and somehow we manage. I'm not sure how sometimes, but I think it's some of the work you talked about binary concepts of gender, about trans people in higher education. That's actually why I wanted to have you today and have you for this podcast. And perhaps just to start off, to educate me is on this topic area. People see gender as a binary thing in society, right? And that's a very common point of view, not the only, of course, but the most common one, where you have males and you have females. And it's very binary. We're starting to challenge that idea. And people are struggling with this, I think. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think you've answered your own question in the sense that people are struggling because we are so used to a binary system of gender, which we have hitched up to a kind of biological, in some way, understanding of two dimorphic sexes, and then that organizes the whole of society. And that in itself is a quite a Western way of thinking. It's the way that we think about the relationship between sex and gender is relatively modern, and so. But it is incredibly entrenched, and it organises sort of almost every facet of society. So I think that this idea that there could be people who are something else, or who are neither gender or both genders, or another type of gender altogether, people don't like it. It messes with the kind of easy, simplistic way in which they've always thought about those things. And so I think people struggle with new information all the time that comes in a framework that they're not familiar with. So I think that at a basic level, it's that. I mean, I think there's more to it in the sense that it threatens certainties. People don't like being able to know what somebody really is, or those kinds of questions. So I think there's a lot going on, but I think it's really interesting for me as a non-binary person, and I've been out for quite a long time now, so like nearly a decade, the shift that's happened even in the last 10 years in terms of people having some kind of understanding that there might be people who exist who don't identify as male or female, more kind of recognition of things like gender neutral pronouns, and increasingly recognition that perhaps we need some kind of legal endorsement of the, or sort of way in which you don't have to be male or female in a kind of legal sense. So things like passports and that kind of thing. We're not there yet in this country, but there are other countries where they're starting to bring in that kind of legislation. So although there is progress, it's which is quite recent. It's very recent, and I think that there's a big gap between people's level of knowledge around this at the moment and their level of kind of fear in some senses, for sure.
I think there's so much in that that I want to unpick, and there's about 3 or 4 different ways I want to take this, and we'll see what I forget and what I remember. But I think even that towards the end, last point about legal representation, I didn't know this until I was preparing for this podcast to talk to you about this. That in the United Kingdom, legally, you can be a man or a woman, but in the eyes of the law, that's all you've got. And so for someone like yourself, or a person who uses they and them as a pronoun, that must be a bit challenging, I'm guessing, to put that politely.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think it just means that you feel like you are... you have to lie on forms. You can't, if you're not given the option, and then that, assumptions continue to be made about you that are not correct. And it's just, it feels like there's no space for you to kind of exist officially, and that is a very undermining kind of feeling. So it's, I mean, the thing is, this is what I was just saying about how it actually, kind of recognition of it in a cultural way has really improved, and it's not great, but it's like something. And the legal stuff is one way of perhaps changing those kind of dominant ways that we think of gender as only binary. Like it's quite symbolic, it's quite significant, but it's not. I mean, it's not necessarily the sort of be all and end all for me. I mean, for me personally, but for a lot of people, I think there are other kinds of ways in which society might change to be more inclusive of a range of gender identities that don't involve, thinking only in terms of markers on passports and that kind of thing. But it is a problem. I'm not going to lie.
So let's go that way then. So you talk about other ways which society can change, be more flexible, more adaptive. What might they be? What might things that either I can do personally, who's very ignorant of this topic, or just in general society can do that could be useful then?
Well, I mean, if I can talk about perhaps the research that I've been doing about non-binary people in higher education, because, that's the sphere that I work in and you work in, and probably a lot of the people listening to this might work in or be students in. And so, I mean, I think, there's a lot of ways in which something like the university experience is very highly gendered, whether it's, when you're a student and you come to register and enroll when you start, whether it's the way that staff address classes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, that kind of thing, whether it is in the way you teach a curriculum. And it would be actually very interesting to think about, how that pans out in the hard sciences versus the social sciences, and the examples that you use, the assumptions that you make about the kind of material that you're talking about. There's all sorts of ways in which that experience becomes very binary, and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of space for anything else. And that could include also things like the physical architecture of the university. So how halls of residences are organised, or toilets on campus, or changing rooms in the sports centres, and all of those kinds of things. And there are ways of making all of that practice more inclusive to a range of gender identities by in a way degendering them, so marking gender less, I think. So why would toilets have to be gendered, or why would all of the toilets have to be gendered, or why do we organize things? Can we think about what language we use in the classroom? Can we ask students what pronouns they would prefer to be referred to by? Can we give them other options when they register, so that their gender is accurately registered on their student record, that kind of thing? And so yeah, I think all of these things are possible and doable kind of right now. There are bigger ways in which binary gender is so entrenched in everything that we do that are obviously going to take a lot longer to shift. But yeah, I think there's sort of surface practical things which can absolutely be changed, and in a lot of ways they have changed. So yeah.
I think we're quite fortunate in a number of ways in that we work in a university system which is sometimes quite progressive. But to stay within the university world and talk about toilets, because I want to talk about toilets today, I'm going to start with a story. I did a lot of my training in Auckland at Auckland University's medical school, and it was built, I forget, in the 50s or 60s. And it has this amazing architectural feature for a tower block, and that it was only built with men's toilets because it was a medical school in the 50s. So of course they only built men's bathrooms. Why would you build women's bathrooms in a school for doctors? Which is a whole nother topic for another day, perhaps. But they never retrofitted it. And so they just went through and changed the signs on every second floor to be from male to female. So all the female bathrooms had a line of urinals that they never tore out. It was a whole thing. It was a running joke for years. But contrasting that to, say, our university with Westminster, well, we've had senior management come out, and our Vice-Chancellor of the University say quite openly and explicitly that we're going to have gender-neutral bathrooms by, I forget the exact date, and I'll look it up and find it. Now, you've done a lot of work in this area, and one of the ways I actually found out about you was a video you posted on YouTube about toilets. Because we've touched on this idea of history, we've touched on the idea of future, but what is it about the history of toilets that is so topical here?
I mean, yeah, so I feel now that like I have a reputation as like the toilet person, and it's a bit undeserved in a sense, because that video came about because I had done a conference paper there's a trans youth organisation called Gendered Intelligence that I do some volunteer work for, and they were having a conference, and they said, can you come and do something about toilets, because obviously it's a big issue for trans people, and it has become a kind of national debate around who's allowed in toilets. I mean, in the States it has been a real flashpoint, and here it is one of the sort of rumbling on discussions. And so I used to do a bit in one of the introductory lectures on one of my gender studies modules about how public toilets are these very kind of fraught spaces that can help us to think about how we divide things up by gender, but also how spaces are segregated often by kind of class and race, and around sexuality and disability, as well as gender and issues around like transgender versus cisgender. And so yeah, so I can't claim to have ever done any kind of proper research about toilets, but it was something that I was also sort of have been involved at Westminster in trying to think about how we might make our facilities more gender neutral in terms of kind of signage, and like you were saying, what kinds of facilities are actually in the toilets, and how the space is organised and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm interested in it because as well, when I go to work, there's often, I think there are gender neutral toilets in most of our buildings, but they are not often in the most convenient places. And so I often find myself having to use the gendered toilets at work, and I don't like that. And a lot of students don't like that who are in this situation. So, yeah, I'm sort of personally invested, but it's also kind of a very kind of useful way of thinking about how gender sort of shapes our world. And so, yeah, I've forgotten your original question because I went off on a tangent, but remind me.
what I was doing unsubtly was queuing you up for a bit of a history question coming next.
The history question,
but,
yeah.
So you use toilets as an example of how we think about gender, and I really like that video, and I'm going to link it below because it was a really interesting conversation about toilets and what they meant and what they represented, and where they came from in European society in terms of, like you mentioned, the idea of class and men's toilets versus women's toilets, because originally, why would you have women's public toilets? And then they became a thing and they had to become a protected thing because of society. But where I was cueing you towards was this original question and statement we had, was when we were talking about you and your role and all these things I want to ask you about and unpick and find, you made this point earlier that our binary view of gender was culturally and historically not unique, that Western culture and that right now culture. So does that mean historically there have been periods of time where gender hasn't been considered such a binary thing? Or to put another way, is this moment in time, as we move away from binary gender with things like gender neutral bathrooms and changing the way we view gender in society versus sex, have we been a flash in the pan for the past period of time?
That is a really interesting question. I mean, I think, historically there have always been people who didn't fit the gender binary. I mean, if we're talking about intersex people who are, that's the more sort of scientific people with disorders of sexual development or differences of sexual development. So it's the kind of sex side rather than the gender side, although the division between sex and gender is up for debate in my opinion. But so there are those people, and then there are people who have never fit, in terms of their gender expression or their gender identity, fit in either of the two kind of binary options. And I think, a lot of that history has been erased, it has been hidden, it isn't well known. And there are lots of cultures around the world where they have kind of third genders or fourth genders, or they have people who are sort of outside of that binary system. And here even in the West, if we think about the history of the kind of science of sex, there have been different models of how people have understood that over time, and the one we have currently understands female bodies and male bodies as kind of two separate species almost. But there have been times in history where it's been about there being only kind of one model of the body, and men and women definitely exist, but they're sort of hierarchically up and down the model rather than two separate kind of things. So I think the way that we think about it now is culturally specific, it's historically specific, and so in 200 years time we might be laughing at the idea that why would you separate people like this, why would you think there was only two of anything, or we might not, I don't know. But yeah, it is a really interesting question, and I think your example of the university building with only men's toilets is a really perfect example. I might incorporate that back into the lecture in the future, and yeah, just because it does speak to the way in which, who do you provide toilets for is people who are in that public space, and what does that tell us about who is entitled to that public space? And this is why there weren't women's public toilets for a long time, whilst there were men's public toilets, because it was a way of further enshrining that idea that genders are very different, and that women belong in the home and they can go to the toilet there, and men can go out in public and pee everywhere they like. So it's and what people were angry about when those toilets were introduced was this idea of women being out in public and women becoming kind of public property, and that was the thing that agitated people, that they didn't like. It was that kind of blurring of the public and the private sphere, which was the way in which those kinds of ideas about men and women as scientifically different were being reinforced kind of socially. So yeah, it's kind of a fascinating history, which like I say, can't claim to know everything about at all. But yeah, we're now at a point where it's sort of playing out around a different set of issues, and quite kind of contentiously so in some cases. Yeah.
So what do you think of the different sets of issues? What do you think is going to be the next set of issues? Where are we going with this?
Oh, Lord. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, it's a very difficult, I think it's a difficult area. And I think we're going to, and my feeling is that we're going to go through a phase where there's a sort of third toilet that's the gender neutral toilet before we can move through into a time when perhaps we don't need to gender toilet spaces at all, or we can think about, I'm really fascinated as to why public toilets are so kind of communal and yet thought of as kind of private spaces at the same time, and why we think that separating them by gender retains that sense of privacy, but if we mix the genders they somehow become not private. There's all sorts of reasons why maybe we do need some gender segregated toilets, but I'm kind of interested in like how did we get to this point where these things have become such sort of truths that people really want to hold on to, and they feel terribly kind of afraid and threatened when those things are come under consideration. And that's kind of what I'm fascinated by.
So you touched on a point there that I maybe reconsider we should have started with at the start. And you touched on this idea of a division between sex and gender. And I'm going to put my scientist hat back on for a second. And when I talk to my students, I talk about gender and sex, and we use the term quite explicitly and very precisely in the life sciences. But for you, when you use this term and you differentiate them, what are we talking about here?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's I've actually been teaching this very recently, so it's all fresh in my head. But so I mean, we often draw a distinction between sex as the sort of biological, anatomical, chromosomes, hormones, genes, brains, whatever it is that we're thinking is somehow sex is located in those facets, and then gender as a kind of social manifestation of that, which is much more culturally changeable and specific. And we all know that gender roles change all the time and gender expectations change all the time, and that's gender and it's social. But I think so there's a sort of branch of feminist theory that's questioning the sort of not the validity of sex, but the kind of way in which it's seen as sort of outside of culture or beyond society, and actually thinking, well, aren't the gendered ideas that we are sort of mired in, what impact have they had on the ways that people have interpreted those things that we see that are different about different kinds of bodies? And it's interesting to think about, where is sex in the body if we're thinking about it in that way? Is it in genitals? Is it in chromosomes? Why is any one part of the body about sex and other parts are not about sex? Humans have lots of different hair colors, for example, but we don't think that is part of sex. Like, what it's a kind of it's not about sort of denying the fact that there are obviously different parts of the body and people have different bodies, but it's about asking, well, what went into dividing them up in this kind of a way? And then, even if there are these two sexed bodies, why would that ever mean that has to translate directly into two distinct gender categories? So there's a lot of questions to ask, I think, about that, and lots of people have asked that, and I think there's some really interesting work in kind of feminist biology, people like Anne Fausto Sterling, for example, who have tried to kind of complexify this idea that sex is quite kind of straightforward and objective and natural and we can't really do anything about it, which is in within the social sciences is very much like, okay, well, we don't understand that science stuff, so it must be true, let's just leave it as it is and concentrate on the social stuff. But I think actually there's a lot of other ways that we might be thinking about it.
I'm going to put my scientist hat back on for a second now again, because we teach, I teach a class called medical physiology, where we give the students this 400-word description of a medical case study, and then they have to try and understand it and do a lot of research and pick it apart. And then they have to write summaries of it. And it's a really intense class that the students really enjoy, but it's a lot of work. And of our rotation of case studies, we had one this year that was an intersex individual who was diagnosed at, I can't remember the exact details, but about 16 or 17, as being genetically a male, but she was anatomically and physically female. And it was a really interesting case study for the students to write up, because it was the only one they got that wasn't just what you call the hard science, the science over there doing this stuff. And that was, it actually had sociological aspects to it, and they had to consider this person's hopes and dreams and aspirations as they were suggesting treatment options. And they found it the most interesting. And I didn't expect that, I've got to admit. There was no genes and receptors and cellular signaling pathways. This one was well, you could do this option, or you could do this option. Let's talk about what that's going to mean for someone, because it was very much a sex versus gender case study. So it's really interesting to think about from that point of view. And then to leave my science hat on for a bit more, which is very unusual for me in these podcasts, I'm sure I should stop saying that. There's another aspect of your work that we haven't really touched on yet. And I want to talk to you about how this overlaps. You talk about fat a lot, about representation of fat in the media, about fat in society. And then you cross your work over as well. And so you talk about trans and fat, and have a Venn diagram of those two things together. So what's good job, Brad. What's this part of your research about? What's the story of this work?
Yeah, well, I think, I've come from, there is a field of fat studies, which is this sort of, the study of fat as a kind of social construction. Yeah, so it's not medical science, but it's understanding the sort of lived experience of fat people, and especially the ways in which that is actually, that fat people are subject to all sorts of kinds of fat phobia and discrimination on the basis of those things. But also, understanding more broadly, how are fat people represented in media? Why is it always so negative and horrible? What are fat people's experiences of, work and sex and all sorts of things? And so, I'm really interested in the ways in which fat is gendered, but also then how gender is sort of fatted, I guess. I was thinking about, the ways in which a lot of kind of weight loss discourses talk about things like, people not feeling feminine when they're fat, if they want to feel feminine, or not feeling masculine as well when they're fat. For people who identify as male, fatness rounds out the body in ways that are kind of feminizing, and ironically for people who are identify as female, it sort of gives them a bulk which is unfeminine. So gender and fat are doing something strange together, and I'm not quite sure what it is still, but yeah, it's definitely there's a kind of intersection there. And I was specifically interested in the experiences of fat trans people, and what role fat played in their kinds of transitions and the types of changes that they might want to or not want to make to their bodies, and how fat, what kind of role it played in how other people read their gender. Because I think we have a kind of idea about where fat has to be located on the body, there are, I think we even refer to it as kind of male pattern fatness and female pattern fatness. And so I was just interested in those kinds of things. And I think there's a lot going on around that. And, what I was finding was that a lot of the work in fat studies was really about cisgendered women and their embodiment and their lived experiences and their problems, basically, which are many and legitimately require study. And then in trans studies, this discussion about bodies was much more about kind of surgeries and genitals and that kind of thing, and I was like, well, those genitals aren't actually attached to the rest of the body. What's going on in the rest of the body? And you do get a lot, a bit of chat about if people go on hormones to transition, then they do cause fat to sort of redistribute around the body. But no, there wasn't a lot of kind of academic work about how people felt about that, or what it meant if you were fat, as to if you were thin. So yeah, those were the things that I was kind of interested in I always say fleshing out, which is just the most obvious and cringy metaphor, but that, yeah.
You're right. It's one of those things where you say that, like, yep, I just said fleshing out when talking about
again.
fat.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. I mean, I know exactly the line that I would use when I'm teaching phenotype, body shape, and masculinization and feminization of fat patterning. And so I can see where you're coming from in terms of fat patterns and people thinking about how that makes me look and feel. So that's an entire field that I hadn't thought about, which I guess is why you're researching it, because that makes a niche which needs to be done, which is fantastic. It's so interesting. Unfortunately, I think that's probably all we have time for today, but it only leaves me to say thank you to Frances Ray White for being here today, just because I want to use the full name, the full title.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's been great. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. And if you did enjoy listening to our podcast, then feel free to subscribe, whether or not you're watching along on YouTube or listening in to the audio version on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts. My name's Bradley Elliott, and this has been this week's Different Conversation.